Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stew again with another episode of Project Spark to C++. This time we're going to talk about variable initialization and declaration. If you watch the other videos in this series, some of this will look familiar, but it needs to be made clear before we move on. When we declare a variable, all we're saying is, here's a variable, it exists. It doesn't have a value, it's just there. When we initialize a variable, we give it a value for the first time. We have some sample lines here. On lines 5 and 7 we're declaring an integer variable named test1 and test3 respectively, but we're not initializing them. On line 6 we're declaring an integer variable named test2 and initializing it with a value of 2. Obviously variables must be declared in C++ before they can be initialized. What may not be obvious is that they must be initialized before you can use them for anything other than declaration or initialization. We have two examples on lines 9 and 13. Line 9 we initialize test1 by giving it a value for the first time. That value is the result of the value of test2 multiplied by 2. We've already declared test1 as an integer variable on line 5, so we can refer to it by name only. Note the difference with what we did on line 6. Also note that test2 is declared as an integer on line 6, so when we use it on line 9, we also refer to it by name only. You don't have to constantly tell the compiler what data type the variable is. You do it once when you declare it. Line 13 looks similar, but unlike test2, test3 has not been initialized, so it has no value. What you're doing here is telling the compiler to multiply 2 by a number that you haven't specified. The compiler isn't going to like that. And here's the result. The program crashes as soon as it gets to that point. With some IDEs, this program won't even compile. The one thing to take away from this video is that variables, all variables in C++, must be initialized in some way before you use them. This is different from Project Spark. Let's see how. Here we are in Project Spark trying to declare variables C++ style, and we're getting a couple of yellow exclamation points telling us that we have an incomplete line. This will lead to a broken brain, and those lines won't do anything. Let's look at what does work in Project Spark. Lines 2 through 4, we have 4 variables, test1, 2, 3, and 4. You can see what we're doing here looks a lot like what we did in C++, but the behavior is going to be a little different. Line 2, test2 is declared and initialized to a value of 2. Line 3, test1 is declared and initialized to the value of test2 times 2, so it should have a value of 4. Line 4, test3 is declared and initialized to the value of test4 times 2. This is the concept that gave us trouble in C++ because our test4 equivalent wasn't initialized and therefore had no value. Real quick, I've set up some code to output all 4 variables to the screen in large format. If you have any questions about how this code works, feel free to ask in the comments. Let's see what happens when we run this. First of all, unlike C++, this runs, so something is clearly different. Test2 is 2 and test1 is 4, just like they should be. You'll recall we set test3 equal to test4 times 2, so why is test3 0? In Project Spark, if you don't explicitly initialize a variable, it will initialize to a default value. In the case of number variables, that default is 0. Test4 isn't explicitly initialized, so Project Spark sets it to 0, and test3 is therefore 0 times 2, which is 0. Looking at our results here, that's what we have. If you're used to this and want to transition to C++, the number one takeaway is that you must initialize a variable before you use it for anything other than declaration and initialization. Really, that's a good idea even in Project Spark, because with programming of any kind, you should always be explicitly telling a program what to do. Otherwise, you can end up with strange behavior and have a hard time tracking it. It's a simple idea, but very important for wrapping up variable basics. Next video, we're going to talk about functions, and then we'll move on to some really interesting concepts I think you'll enjoy. That's all for this episode. See you next time.